Thank you, Milind. Thank you, Chhavi, for being here. Thank you to everybody for sticking to the end of this program today. We've heard a lot today about what individuals, what companies, what politicians can do to increase equality, to promote inclusiveness, and so on. What we want to talk about here is what political systems can do, what fundamentally democracy can do to promote equality and inclusiveness, right? India is the world's largest democracy, obviously, justifiably proud of that. It has remained a democracy over 70 plus years when many of its neighbors have not. Yet, in just the last 2 years, according to the Pew Research, the share of Indians who say that they're happy with the way Indian democracy is working has declined from nearly 80% to barely over 50%. Why do you think that is? What explains this sort of feeling that democracy is not working for people here? I want to start with you, Chhavi.
I think there are multiple factors to it. But before I go on to speak about it, do you want the rural perspective or the general?
Yes, from the local level. Yes,
local
the
governments.
grassroots level.
I think what happens often at the grassroots is that there's not enough information and awareness. And also because there are no parameters set onto what kind of person gets the ticket or can contest. Because often when I speak to the residents in villages, we wish that there were parameters set, that there is a basic criteria that is needed for, before someone gets to choose to come into politics. You can't just have any goon and murderer and so on and so forth be allowed to contest. So often people switch off because of that. And also, as of today, if I were to compare to, say, when I was younger, as of today, I think what's also happening is that with technology, while there's a plus, but in villages, because there is no one to really guide people on how to best use the technology that's come in, it may be in the way of televisions, mobile phones, and now social media. So as a result of that, and people not being aware of how to differentiate between authentic news and authentic information, most people believe that anything that gets onto social media is true. So they really can't filter things. And there are also locally greater influences. The dynamics are such where people kind of get influenced by many factors. It could be caste, it could be people who are higher up on the pyramid or economically stronger or politically stronger, and therefore they tend to bully the other people and do not allow them the choices that they should be making. But I think the biggest influencing factor at the moment would be technology and how it has come in bringing along the negative element. Right. And as a result of that, people look at more of the wave that's going across, and also the perception is that whoever is at the center, we should choose whichever candidate is in sync with the ruling party at the center. Because they believe it's anyone else, then their work may not get done and they may not see development happen. So they're not necessarily voting for the individual at the local level, but looking at what the wave is. And I think that would perhaps be one of the biggest factors where the trend has shifted immensely.
Right, interesting. Milind, would you agree?
Yeah, did you say that 50% of Indians now
54%, which is still a healthy number, say that democracy is working for them, or that they're happy with the way democracy is working. But it used to be almost 80% not that long ago.
Yeah, because I mean, when I think of the election that just took place in April 2019, I don't think we should forget that out of 900 million eligible voters, 600 million Indians, as in 67% of Indians actually exercised their franchise in the last election. So I think India in that sense is a democracy which is unique, where in spite of the fact that there are segments that are getting increasingly disenchanted with the political process, there's still very high turnout. So there's still a very high participation in the political and democratic process. I think part of the reason for the growing disenchantment towards politics, I would agree with Chhavi that social media has turned things around. It's certainly changed the nature of representative democracy. Because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you needed to access your MLA, your member of parliament, your elected representative to reach out to a particular minister or to the government. today with tools like right to information, with social media, you can actually tweet to a union minister and get a reply back. So I think in that sense, social media or RTI have, to some extent, disintermediated representatives. And I don't think that political institutions, in India, for instance, we inherited parliamentary democracy from the British, the Westminster system of democracy. I don't think we've allowed those institutions to evolve or upgraded those institutions as society has evolved. And as a result of that, maybe younger people feel that why should I go through the political process? Let me go through social media. In the US, for instance, you're seeing the left, people who are on the left of the center, they're in fact believing increasingly in anarchy. And their faith in democratic institutions is coming down. So I think these are concerns that people have, but it depends on country to country. You know, if you look at Brazil, for instance, recently, where you had a leader like Bolsonaro win the elections, crime levels in Brazil were very, very high. And the average Brazilian had lost faith in politicians, had lost faith in political institutions. They had lost faith in the media. They had lost faith in the judiciary. And the only one institution that remained uncorrupted was the armed forces. And therein came Bolsonaro, a leader who was very close to the army. And of course, a country like Brazil, which has a history of being ruled by the armed forces, they elected somebody like that. So I think it's important for us as a society, and certainly for policy makers and politicians, to keep upgrading these institutions so that the electorate, and especially young voters, continue to be motivated and inspired to take part in the political process. Because if people lose faith in the political systems and institutions, if they lose faith in other soft powers and other pillars of our democracy like the media, like the judiciary, you'll inch dangerously closer towards what could happen in other countries in our neighborhood as well.
Right, excellent. So I want to throw this out to the audience. We have a poll question here, so I want you to have some input into this. The question is, what is India's greatest strength? Some people say it is democracy. Is it that? Is it the talent pool? Is it the Indian labor force? Is it Indian religion and culture? Or is it the size of the Indian market? Think about that, vote. I'm going to come back to you guys on this a little bit later as well. Milind, let me continue with you. After several years of messy coalitions at the center, sort of a mixed parliament, we see now a single party dominating at the center in the way that your Congress party used to, right? But it's a different party, obviously. Is this healthy for Indian democracy to have such a weak national opposition in Delhi or not?
I think in India we overemphasize and over-debate this coalition versus single rule party. Okay. I think countries like India, countries like the United States, I think the democracies are so evolved and so robust that we have the ability to absorb the shocks of a coalition government, whatever good and bad a majority government gives with us. So I think we overestimate the good and the pros and cons of this issue. I think India, if you look at economics and economic growth as a parameter, in the last 30 years, 2014 was the first time in 30 years that we had a majority government, a government minus a coalition. That got repeated a few months ago. In spite of that, in the last 35 years, with a single party rule, with coalition politics, with different parties at the helm, with a third front government, India has done exceedingly well. So when you asked me, you asked about these questions, which is more important? I certainly believe democracy is ultimately the greatest leveler and it's the greatest asset we have as a country. But I do believe that our country is large enough, mature enough, deep enough, and our democracy is robust enough to absorb any of these shocks. I wouldn't even call them shocks, frankly. I think these are natural transitions in the life of a democracy. And I think a country like the United States or India can easily absorb these. And I say this because I have so many friends in the US who are Democrats, who were extremely disturbed when Donald Trump became president. I have so many friends in the US who are Republicans who were extremely disturbed when President Obama got elected and he was, when he nationalized General Motors, for instance. But I would always tell them that your country, like mine, the democracy is deep enough to absorb that.
All right. Chhavi, at the local level, would you agree with this? I mean, you've been the head of your village now for almost 10 years, around 10 years. In that time, do you feel like grassroots democracy in India has gotten stronger? Has your job gotten easier in some ways?
I wouldn't say my job has gotten any easier, but I think democracy definitely has become better compared to, say, what it was earlier, in the sense that people do have a voice. The women and the marginalized do know that if there is an enabler, which could be in the form of good leadership, or even in terms of getting the awareness and becoming aware of what's out there for them, in terms of through the rights, through the kind of schemes and benefits that the government may have. So when they become aware of that and they get educated about it, they start asking. And unless until you don't ask, things don't really happen. So to see that that is changing, to see that even women are coming in the forefront, and those who are marginalized, which could be owing to the lower economic strata, which could be owing to the crazy caste issue, which I think is the biggest hindrance and deterrent to development in our country. But now I think people are coming out. And I'm very happy to also note that at least in my panchayat, I've noticed that with my being there and people knowing that I play fair and I don't fall into the trap of any kind of discrimination, I have zero tolerance to it. With that, I've even noticed the youth and children coming forward. And that for me is a plus. Because I personally believe that at the grassroots, it's actually easier to have the democracy unfold itself and see its development and empowerment happen in the true sense, because it's a smaller, closely knit society where at the end of the day, worst case scenario, whatever the conditions may be, people do come together. Though of course, compared to olden times, that is disintegrating, because community that community spirit, unfortunately, we're beginning to lose out on, but it's still better than what the cities are at. And also when people understand that the leadership or whatever the enabling force may be, when it's working for their benefit and they are made to realize that they are the real stakeholders, they're willing to change and accept change to such an extent that the traditional norms or the short-sightedness is something that they push away within seconds, provided they realize that it is for their benefit. And then they will go against all odds to come forward to ensure that that process of empowerment or development happens in the true sense. But unfortunately, there are too many, if I were to put it simply, that there are too many factors which do still kind of try and control and restrict that from happening in the true sense.
Social factors, you mean, in terms of social structures within the village, or do you mean forces outside the village that are
both?
Okay.
Yeah, because I also feel that a lot of the leadership, and I don't mean just polity, but even say the grassroots government officials, there is often a very myopic perspective. People are only looking at say if it is polity, they're only looking at their term, the duration of the term. They're not looking at something sustainable and long-term. And I think that is very, very unfortunate. And even at the grassroots, many government officials I've noticed, they feel that if they empower the people, then who's going to come to them? Which is really unfortunate. Of course, my counter-argument with them is that if you empower people, given the expanse of things that are needed to be done in this country, and the large democracy that we have in terms of the population that we have, the diversity that we have, there is a huge canvas, because there's still so much that needs to be done in our country. And I think people sitting there at those positions just need to recognize that and realize that when you're doing good for the society or for the state or for the country, you're doing good for yourself and your family as well. And I think if people realize that, and then things will change. And I think leadership is more about, it's more like parenting. If you can have leaders understand that, I think people will understand what short-term, mid-term, and long-term visions are, and then they will wholeheartedly participate in that process and make life easier, not just for themselves, but even for the leadership, be it polity or bureaucracy.
Can I just come in? I think she makes a very important point, because in Indian politics, and if you look at the relationship between political parties and the electorate, the perception is that if New Delhi gets fixed, the country gets fixed.
Right.
And I think that in a country like ours, where we have a three-tier system of government, you have state governments, you have the federal government, and then you have local governance. Local government, unfortunately, is woefully under-empowered as compared to state governments and central governments. So, like we were chatting about earlier, Chhavi says that even panchayats and rural local bodies aren't as empowered as they should be. But in India, one of the greatest tragedies is that while we are one of the fastest urbanizing economies in the world, second to China, where people are moving from rural areas to our cities in search of jobs and a better life, we as a country have failed to absorb that urbanization and to grow our cities, not just our 5 or 6 large metros, but tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities. And the reason for that is there is very poor local governance. So today, if I were to ask this hall, which I'm presuming most people are from Mumbai, and if I were to ask the people of Mumbai to name the city's mayor, very few hands would go up. Almost nobody would be able to name who Mumbai's mayor is, even if you live in Mumbai city. And that shows you how poorly our city is run. And this has nothing to do with party A or party B, but the fact that successive governments have failed to devolve powers to the local level. And that's where democracy really happens.
Right.
And that's where good governance actually happens.
Right. So we need more democracy, not less here.
And I'm going to add to something that Milind said previously, if I may. I don't believe that our democracy or people are mature enough to really understand democracy in the true sense. Because what I've noticed is people speak about their rights, and they do so very vocally. But when it comes to speaking about their own responsibilities, they shy away. And that's very, very prominent at the grassroots. And I don't really blame the residents of the rural sector, because I think that awareness and education that needs to come through doesn't really come through in the true sense. And therefore, there is that disconnect. If that connection and that awareness and education is made, and we are really made to become that mature citizen, then you will really see things unfold in a better way.
How do you encourage that? I mean, I'm thinking particularly in terms of women in your village, and this is a fairly traditional part of Rajasthan. Has the fact that you are a woman, you're not the only female village leader, but one of few, how much of a difference has that made to their sense of empowerment and their involvement in governance within the village and so on?
Oh, it's huge. It's amazing. Because they know that there is someone who's going to listen to them and will stand up for their rights and even protect them. It is, unfortunately, quite a patriarchal and chauvinistic society as well. So they, of course, the women, especially those who are married into the village, are the ones who see the worst of it. And I'm happy to see that with my being there, they just know that they can be themselves. And I think that in itself is empowering. Right. And when the mothers become like that, then of course the next generation definitely are a step ahead.
Right.
And also our engagements, and again, what I find very, very interesting is perhaps because I'm very inclusive, and I try and ensure that nobody feels threatened by my being there, because I do believe more in a participatory form of governance. So as a result of that, and also of course because I was able to deliver within the first 6 months of coming into office, which is something the village was not really used to. And as a result of that, I think I have won faith and trust of the men as well. And as a result of that, what's happened is that the women, especially the daughters-in-law of the households, who otherwise weren't allowed to step out of the household, not even to the neighbor's household, are allowed, the only house that they're allowed to come to is mine, without anyone escorting the women. And that's where I get women from different hamlets, from different communities to come together, and it's beautiful to see that they realize that the other lady is also going through something similar. And just that dialogue and conversation amongst each other in itself is also empowering. And we have created or tried to create meaningful engagements where one woman who knows a certain skill or a young girl who knows certain skill sets, who shares it and teaches it to the other. So there's that engagement becomes far more sustainable and also gets the community, gets the women and the girls together, making that, making it a stronger collective.
Right.
And that's one of the things I'm trying to do is get people to understand the power of the collective so that tomorrow, no matter what kind of leadership comes or takes on that role, if they can stand up as a collective force, they can ensure that what their demands are is actually met with. And if that leadership is doing something wrong, then once they question, then you can ensure that the checks and balances are put across to that leadership and he or she behaves.
Right, right. Yeah. And how important is this at the national level? I mean, at the village level, half of village council seats are reserved for women currently in most
Come
states.
again?
At the village level, half of seats are reserved for women in many states, if not most states.
Even in cities, actually.
In cities as well.
So in Maharashtra, for instance, in urban local bodies, in the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, 50% of the seats are reserved for women.
But how critical would it be to do something similar at the national level? Is that even possible to do?
Well, there's a long-standing debate on
That expression says it all.
No, there's a long-standing debate in our country on reservation for women. At least 33%, one-third of parliament and assemblies should be reserved for women. I personally believe that there should be greater participation of women in democracy, in politics. My own experience, if I look at the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, what ends up happening, and this is across political parties, whether you're in Congress, BJP, you name the party, is people actually, if there's a local leader, and he has been a municipal councillor 3 or 4 times, and he's a strong, powerful, well-respected leader who can win elections, and if his seat gets reserved for a woman, what ends up happening is that the ticket goes to his wife or his sister or his daughter. So in some sense, reservation is important, but if the remote control is in the hands of a man, then I'm not sure it serves its purpose. So I think that if reservation happens, and I think it should happen, I think affirmative action with regards to getting more women into politics and parliament is the need of the hour. But there have to be safeguards, perhaps at the party level, not at a government and a legal level, to ensure that it's not wives, daughters, mothers, sisters of established, entrenched politicians who get tickets, but it's actually people who are working on the ground.
Okay. Now I think we're just about out of time. I want to throw up the results of the poll and ask each of you what's your answer. Is it democracy? Is it India's workforce? Is it India's culture? Or the size of its market? What's India's greatest strength? Chhavi, 30 seconds to you.
I'd say, are we allowed to choose two?
Yes.
Great. I'd say democracy and talent pool.
The talent pool.
Yes.
The talent. Entrepreneurialism.
If it's allowed that space to, where the talent is visible. So I'm speaking from the perspective of the rural sector, where the opportunities are not always provided. So once that happens, then that also would be a huge plus.
Right. Okay. And Milind?
I think democracy. I mean, democracy is it solves every problem, and eventually, any organization, any country, any company, any political party, if it's truly democratic, the best person, the best individual, and ultimately the best idea will always succeed.
Excellent. All right. On that note, please join me in thanking our panelists for being here today.